The reading for today is Luke 17:11 to 19. On the way to Jerusalem, Jesus was going through the region between Samaria and Galilee. As he entered a village, 10 lepers approached him. Keeping their distance, they called out, saying, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." When he saw them, he said to them, "Go and show yourselves to the priest." And as they went, they were made clean. Then one of them, when he saw that he was healed, turned back, praising God with a loud voice. He prostrated himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him, and he was a Samaritan. Then Jesus asked, "Were not 10 made clean? But the other 9, where are they? Was none of them found to return and give praise to God except this foreigner?" Then he said to him, "Get up and go on your way. Your faith has made you well."
Thank you, Tara. Familiar story for all of us in Luke 17. Luke is the only gospel writer that records this one for us. It's often used to illustrate the importance of thankfulness or great gratitude, and I think it does teach that lesson. The one that came back and worshiped God and thanked Jesus, Jesus makes a point of commending. But I actually, now that Andy reminded me I've been pastoring for 7 years this week, so, and I've taught on this before, but not from this angle, and you guys are used to that. Because as we grow and as we seek after Jesus and we follow Jesus, he reveals more things to us. And I'm appreciative of that. I'm glad I don't have to keep preaching all my old messages over and over again, that I can bring something new. So to summarize, on his way to Jerusalem, 10 lepers call out for mercy to Jesus. He tells them, go show yourselves to the priest. He doesn't actually go and heal them immediately, like usually when Jesus heals somebody, he does it, then and there on the spot. This time he doesn't. He tells them to go show themselves to the priest, and they are healed of their leprosy on their way to see the priest. Presumably 9 of them do what he told them to do, go and show themselves to the priest. But one disobeys him and returns. But he's the one that Jesus commends in this story. He asks, where are the others? Is it really the case that only one who had the decency to give God the glory was this foreigner? So he also points out that this was a Samaritan, this wasn't a Jew. I really think the other 9 were probably Jewish, but this one who was a Samaritan is the only one that came back. It's fascinating. Jesus commends the one who disobeyed him and criticizes the ones who obeyed him. I don't know if you've ever thought of it that way, but I've subtitled it this: when disobeying Jesus is the right thing to do. It might seem incorrect, but let's look at the text. Starting at verse 11, on the way to Jerusalem, Jesus was going through the region between Samaria and Galilee. As he entered a village, 10 lepers approached him. Keeping their distance, they called out, saying, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." Note right off the bat where this takes place. In the region between Samaria and Galilee, or on the margin between Samaria and Galilee. And not only that, as he entered a village, so now he's on another barrier, another margin, the margin between the town and the surrounding area. Jesus is approached by 10 lepers. Lepers were marginalized people. They were people that were kept at a distance. They knew their place and they kept their distance from other people. But they call out to Jesus for mercy from their place on the margin of their village, on the margin between Samaria and Galilee. Had they heard about Jesus before? I mean, why would they call out to Jesus for mercy if they hadn't heard of him? Or did they recognize him, kind of like the man of the Gadarenes did? There's no indication that the man of Gadarenes, when Jesus stepped across from him, he's a guy with a legion of demons, when Jesus stepped his foot on the shore, that he had heard of Jesus. This was a Gentile region, a Roman region. But he recognized Jesus when he stepped on the shore. So I'm not sure whether these lepers had heard about Jesus before, or if they recognized him, because often marginalized people recognize God when others of us don't. Outcasts, marginalized people, victims have an ability to perceive God sometimes when others don't. So this is really a story about marginal places and the people that live there. The marginalized people that live on the margins. These people were people who had been marginalized by their community, their religious community in particular. We might think of it as kind of a quarantine. So let's talk about leprosy a little bit in the Bible. In the Bible, leprosy refers to a whole wide range of skin conditions. They didn't have the ability to diagnose leprosy as a specific disease like we have today. So when the Bible, whenever it speaks of leprosy, it's not really talking about what we understand as leprosy today. It's talking about any kind of a skin condition that meets some particular qualifications that are all laid out in Leviticus 13. And Leviticus 13 describes how the priests were to diagnose various skin conditions to determine if they were leprous or not. So your priest was your doctor, basically. Your priest was the guy that determined whether you were sick enough to stay in the community or not. He would ask, and if you read Leviticus 13, the questions are things like this. Was the condition more than skin deep? Did the body hair turn white around the condition or not? Did the condition erupt through the skin? What was the color of this condition, the skin condition? Was there raw flesh exposed? And had the condition spread over the whole body? Then after the examination, the priest would declare whether the person was ceremonially clean or ceremonially unclean. If he declared that they were unclean, then they were to be to live apart or be confined. Actually, it says to confine them for 7 days, and then he would do this whole inspection again to see if they could be restored to their community. But if the disease was chronic and it did not heal, the person was to live outside the camp on the margins, because there was presumably no help for that person. Here's and if you were in that condition, a chronic leprous condition, this was your lot. The person who has the leprous disease shall wear torn clothes, and let the hair of his head be disheveled. And he shall cover his upper lip and cry out, unclean, unclean. He shall remain unclean as long as he has the disease. He is unclean. He shall live alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. Now, we're not sure how much people of this time understood contagious diseases. When I've looked it up, I found that the Greeks actually, a couple hundred years BC, started to get a clue about infectious disease, and they could be transmitted from one person to another. So we might think that Leviticus 13 was written with that in mind, but to my knowledge, nowhere in the Bible does it freight this text with that meaning. In other words, what I'm saying is there's no indication that they really understood contagious disease. In their law, they were told to separate people that had these conditions, but we're not told why we were to separate them, except through some inferences that we'll get at. We are very conscious of taking precautions against infectious diseases, but they were not. And really, even as we go around the world and encounter people groups, they even today have no consciousness of infectious diseases. In many poverty-stricken areas, just freely mingle wastewater with their fresh water, and it causes all kinds of problems. So for the message today, I'm mostly interested in how people thought about leprosy, or where did it come from. Not that they had a consciousness of it being a contagious disease and that they quarantined these people for the safety of the whole community, because there isn't really any indication that they thought about leprosy that way that I'm aware of in the Old Testament. But I'll give you a couple of examples of how they did think about leprosy. The story of Miriam. Remember, Miriam is the one that oversaw Moses. But in Numbers 12, it records Miriam and Aaron complaining about Moses because Moses had married a Cushite woman, a foreigner. And God then appears in a cloud, and in verse 9 we read this, "And the anger of the Lord was kindled against them, and he departed, and when the cloud went away from over the tent, Miriam had become leprous, as white as snow. Then Moses prays that God would heal Miriam, and she actually is healed in 7 days. So here, Miriam and Aaron are complaining about God's representative, Moses, complaining that he had married a foreigner. And God becomes angry and gives Miriam leprosy. Not sure why he didn't give Aaron leprosy too. But in the text, it's Miriam that gets leprosy because of God's anger. But because of Moses' prayer, she's healed in 7 days. So here's an example of leprosy being attributed to the anger of God because people had complained against God's representative, Moses. Okay, here's another story. King Uzziah in 2 Chronicles 26. Uzziah enters the temple to worship God by making an offer, bringing his own offering of incense to the altar of incense. The priests in the temple resist him, saying, "You shouldn't be here because you're not a priest after the order of Aaron." He was the king, but he was not in the priesthood. Uzziah becomes upset about them not allowing him to offer this offering, and leprosy breaks out on his forehead. And verse 20 says, specifically, the Lord had struck him. The Lord had struck him, and he remained leprous until he died. So in this story, Uzziah, in desiring to worship God, was struck by God with leprosy. Uzziah wanted to worship God himself in a personal way without having to go through this priesthood. But what does God do? He gives him leprosy for life in this story. So according to these Old Testament stories, what can we say about leprosy, or about how leprosy was understood at the time of Jesus? I think we could say this. Leprosy was understood as a disease that God caused if you dared to question his representative or his priests, or if you worshiped God in an incorrect way. You following me? I mean, this is a scriptural idea, is it not? According to these two Old Testament stories, if you had leprosy, it was because you had done something terribly wrong, and God himself gave you the leprosy in response. There's another story, the story of Naaman being healed of leprosy, that's similar, but I won't take time to go there. That's in 2 Kings 5 if you want to look at it. But back to today's text. Jesus is in a marginal region between Samaria and Galilee. He's entering a town, in other words, crossing another margin where lepers are living because they've been marginalized by their religious community, and they call out to him for mercy. And then in verse 14, when he saw them, he said to them, "Go and show yourselves to the priests." And as they went, they were made clean. So the first thing is Jesus sees these lepers. He doesn't marginalize the marginalized. He sees them where they are, where they're living. He doesn't just walk by and ignore them like the people in his community, their community would have done. He sees the people that have been pushed to the margins by their religious communities. Now, this is not to say that these lepers probably hadn't done anything wrong. I'm sure they had done something wrong. We've all done things that are wrong. But their leprosy was believed to have been from God. And they believed this because of at least 3 Old Testament stories I'm aware of. Plus, you could throw Deuteronomy 28 in there and say that this must have been a self-evident curse from God because of their sickness. But what does Jesus do? He heals them. But he doesn't heal them then and there like he almost always does. Usually when he heals somebody, he either touches them or he speaks to them, or like the woman with the issue of blood, she touched him. Sometimes he just says, you're made well, your sins are forgiven, you're whole. This one is different, though. He doesn't heal them then and there. He says, "Go and show yourselves to the priests." And then as they went, they were made clean. So this is not really even talking about healing. It's about being made ceremonially clean from being ceremonially unclean. Which in order for that to happen, their skin condition would have had to have cleared up to the point that they could be diagnosed according to Leviticus 13. So Jesus usually healed people on the spot. The fact that he doesn't heal these people on the spot is a clue, I think, that something else is going on in this story. I mean, whenever Jesus does something completely different or out of character for him, I think we ought to ask why. What's going on? So when he tells them to go and show themselves to the priest, this puts some distance then between Jesus and these 10 lepers. And it says they were healed as they were obeying Jesus. As they were doing what he told them, they were healed. But then something strange happens. Then one of them, when he saw that he was healed, turned back, praising God with a loud voice. He prostrated himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him, and he was a Samaritan. So the Samaritan stops obeying Jesus. He stops on his trek to this priest. He doesn't go show himself to the priest. He turns back, praising God, and falls at Jesus' feet, thanking him. And how does Jesus respond to this man's disobedience? He asks, "Were not 10 made clean? But the other 9, where are they? Was none of them found to return and give praise to God except this foreigner?" This is really interesting. Jesus praises the disobedient one. And he questions why the other 9 didn't disobey him as well. Did Jesus need his ego to be stroked? Did he set them off hoping that they'd come back and fall down in worship of him? I don't think that's what's going on. Jesus is a great teacher. I think we can all agree that. And teachers use lots of different methods in order to teach. I was trained as a teacher. We have several teachers in our congregation. And there's a method that's in common use today called inquiry-based teaching, or inquiry-based teaching. So I have a short video here that'll show an example in a high school classroom of inquiry-based teaching. So they've been discussing the treatment of traitors during the Civil War period. And a student asks about the penalty for treason, because it looks like they've been talking about treason in the Civil War period. And the student asks, well, what happens today for somebody that's convicted of treason? And then the discussion kind of goes toward, well, how come, what is the penalty and why is that the case? So here goes the video.
But what happens?
What is freedom mean to the different players in the post-war period?
So what happens with people who commit treason right now?
Right now?
Yeah.
Today?
Yeah.
What happens with people who are convicted of treason?
Do they get sentenced for how long? It's not it's a felony, right?
It's more than the felony. I mean, treason. You can be executed for treason.
Oh wow. Okay. So, and I feel that all these people committed treason. So why can't they just be executed?
I mean, the thing you see about student voice in all these clips is that what the kids say drive the lessons, right? Your questions are nothing if the kids don't say things, and so that their comments and the framing of their comments, the comparing of their comments, the response to each other's comments, it's, that's what drives the discussion as much as anything the teacher does. They're reacting to the text based on things that they know, things that they've learned, things that they think, but they're also analyzing at the same time, and that's the voice we want. We want the voice that is deeply personal, but is also analytical.
We want the voice that is deeply personal, but is also analytical. So this is a contemporary example of a teaching method that is encouraging the students to engage in the lesson, not just to sit as passive receptors of knowledge. It relies heavily on the thoughts and the questions of the students. The teacher just doesn't lecture. He presents a situation and the students are expected to engage in that situation, to take part in the whole experience. I think maybe this is what's going on with Jesus and the 10 lepers, something like this. So let me ask this question. By sending the lepers off to show themselves to the priests, what was Jesus doing? Who is Jesus sending them to? He's sending them back to the very people who had marginalized them in the first place. He's sending them back to the religious system that believed God had given them leprosy. It is true that these same priests could now restore them back to their to their religious community, but what would have changed? Well, certainly it would have been better for them than it was, because they wouldn't be living on the margins, but the whole religious system that caused them to be marginalized in the first place would not have changed at all, would it? They would still understand God as a petty judge that sends skin disease to people that either question his representatives or want to worship him in a personal way without some priesthood in between. I think Jesus was setting up what we'd call today an inquiry-based classroom experience for these 10 lepers, in which he hopes that they're going to ask him some questions. Questions like these. Why, if Jesus can heal me, do I need to go back to the religious system that couldn't heal me? Like, these guys have to go back to the priest. It says, as they're going, they're healed. So what are they thinking? What's going on in their heads now as they're walking back to the synagogue? Here's one question they might have been thinking. Why, if Jesus can heal me, do I need to go back to the religious system that couldn't heal me in the first place? They just drove me out of the city, separated me, and left me there. Or they might have asked, why did Jesus see me out here on the margins and care about me? Or they might have asked, does this mean that God isn't angry with me? Because they would have presumed that they had done something wrong. Maybe they had settled, maybe they had analyzed their whole life and figured out, oh, it must have been this thing that I did that caused God to give me leprosy. Because I can think of Miriam, or if I can think of Uzziah, or I can think of Naaman and see that, oh, that makes sense. So maybe they'd accepted the judgment of their religious community, that the God that they worshipped was angry enough with them to cause them to be leprous and excluded from their community. But it seems to me that 9 out of these 10 didn't ask these questions, or at least they didn't go back to the one who had made them clean. Instead, they went back to the ones who had declared them unclean. All except one, the Samaritan. So not only was this man marginalized as a leper, he was also a Samaritan, a people the Jews marginalized as a whole people group. I think the other 9 lepers were probably Jews because of the way Jesus speaks when the Samaritan returned to him. Jesus said, were not 10 made clean, but the other 9, where are they? Was none of them found to return and give praise to God except this foreigner? So the implication there is that there was one Samaritan in their midst. It's interesting, though, that as lepers, the 9 Jews accepted the one Samaritan among them. I think there's something about being marginalized that often makes us more hospitable than when we're among the powerful. If you're a marginalized person, you're cast out of your community. Often, as I've dealt with homeless people and stuff, they're more welcoming than people that in the big churches and the wealthy people. They'll share what meager food they have with another homeless person because they know something about each other. And like I was getting to in the beginning, maybe they recognize Jesus as being in some way divine because there is what James Allison calls the intelligence of the victim, that we as privileged people forfeit access to if we don't listen to the voices of the marginalized. It's not that we're incapable of perceiving it, but the channel it comes through is often the marginalized people. So when Jesus says, go and show yourself to the priests, plural, not priest, he's revealing that there's more than one priesthood involved here. Because if this was just a little Jewish city on the margins, it's very unlikely that they would have had more than one priest in their synagogue. So the inference is he knew that one of these guys was Samaritan. And he couldn't go back to the priests of the Jewish guys. He would have to go to his Samaritan priest. Because the Samaritans had a very similar take on leprosy. What would he have said to the Samaritan priest? Well, Jesus, the Jewish rabbi, made me clean. Can you imagine that conversation? Maybe as this Samaritan was walking all alone, because he would have split off from the other 9, because he would have been going to a Samaritan village to go to see his priest, maybe he began asking himself these questions. But he would have asked them something like this: why, if Jesus can heal a Samaritan like me, do I need to go back to the religious system that couldn't heal me? Or why did Jesus, a Jew, see me, a Samaritan, who the Jews despise out here on the margins, and care about me? Or does this mean that God isn't angry with me, and maybe God isn't angry with my people either? See, outsiders bring something different and important to the table. This outsider was the only one who, in disobeying Jesus, received his commendation. He's the only one who saw his healing as an inquiry-based moment, you could say. He's the only one that actually took action like inquiry-based classrooms encourage the students to do. Don't take it at face value that what your teacher is telling you is what you just need to accept hook, line, and sinker. You think Jesus might have taught this way? You think he might have laid out some scenarios in hopes that the people that he was listening to would ask questions about those scenarios and not just take them at face value? Then Jesus says to the Samaritan, then he said to him, get up and go on your way. Your faith has made you well. Your faith has made you well. Faith in what? Well, probably not faith in the religious system that had marginalized him. Probably faith in Jesus. Outside the city, on the margins, completely apart from his sacrificial religious system. And then he says, your faith has made you well. It doesn't say clean. This is actually a different Greek word here than when it says that as they went, they were made clean. That's speaking to they were made well enough that they weren't going to be excluded from their community any longer. Their skin condition was cleared up enough that it wasn't either erupting through their skin, it wasn't raw flesh showing. All those qualifications in Leviticus 13. But here Jesus says a different word. He says, your faith has made you well. That's the Greek word sozo, which we get salvation from, which means saved, healed, and delivered, or whole. You're made whole here. So this one, because of his faith, not in a religious system that had excluded him, but his faith in Jesus who met him on the margins, he was now not just cleansed and made capable of joining his sacrificial religious community again, but he's actually made whole. He's completely saved, healed, and delivered. You might even say that if he actually had leprosy, if this was what we understand as leprosy, you lose limbs, you lose fingers, you lose earlobes. So maybe all of that came back too. I don't know if it means physically whole or not, but his faith, but no longer his faith in the system that had marginalized him, made him well. And then Jesus doesn't send the Samaritan now back to his priest. He just says, go on your way. Go on your way. I think that reveals that it wasn't Jesus' goal in this whole story to get them to go to their priests anyway. His goal was to get them to place their faith in a different place than they had placed it before. The Jews and Samaritans had serious differences over how and where to worship. Remember the woman at the well that Jesus spoke to was a Samaritan. She said to Jesus, we Samaritans worship in this mountain. It doesn't tell you where, but it was Mount Gerizim. That was the mountain that the Samaritans had their temple on. But you, referring to Jesus, worship in Jerusalem. So they had a different place that they worshiped. They worshiped in different ways. So there was significant differences in worship between the Samaritans and the Jews. Remember, Uzziah, we're told, was given leprosy for violating the rules of Jewish worship. He went into the temple and he wasn't authorized to go in. This Samaritan was made whole, though, when he fell at Jesus' feet and worshipped him, violating his prescribed religious place of worship and practices of worship. Oh yeah, this is a hard lesson to get sometimes. Remember how we explained leprosy in the beginning. Leprosy was understood as a disease that God caused if you dared to question his representative or his priests, or if you worshiped God in an incorrect way. I have another short video. Here's another teacher describing inquiry-based method of teaching. He talks about having 2 Bosnian students come and join his class, and their English wasn't very good. They just come from Bosnia. But the curriculum, if you can imagine this, that they were about to undertake was the teaching of Romeo and Juliet. Shakespearean English to a couple of barely English-speaking Bosnian students. So you might want to turn this one up just a little lower.
Just as an example, I was teaching Romeo and Juliet a couple years ago. Had a couple boys from Bosnia ride off the boat. If we're doing Romeo and Juliet, they're cooked. But if we're doing an inquiry, such as what makes and breaks relationships, they can involve themselves because I can have them read the manga version of Romeo and Juliet. Those boys got interested and went online to find Romeo and Juliet stories from Bosnia. And they found 2. I thought they were talking folk tales. In fact, they were talking news articles. I said to them, wow, because they're in Bosnia, you have to translate those stories and make a manga version for us so that we can benefit from that story. Well, you see what happened. In a normal classroom that's information transmission, they're marginalized because they can't really read and write English that well. But because we're doing inquiry, their difference privileged them because they knew stuff nobody else knew, and they brought stuff to the common project that nobody else could bring.
The Samaritans, this is his last statement, their difference privileged them because they knew stuff nobody else knew, and they brought stuff to the common project that nobody else could bring. The Samaritan's difference privileged him. There was something different about him, not only that he was marginalized by his Samaritan community, but he was also marginalized by the Jews, but they'd found some kind of cohort together as jointly marginalized people out there outside the city. But I don't think Jesus was looking for blind obedience to a religious system that said that God had inflicted people with leprosy here in this story. He was looking for people that could recognize God in the one who could cleanse them, heal them, and make them whole. Sometimes we read these stories and we just take everything just as at face value, and then the story becomes really just a lesson about gratitude. And I don't want to diminish that. I think gratitude is really a big piece of this lesson, although I haven't focused on that today. But I think as you start and the story begins with Jesus was going through, on the way to Jerusalem through a marginal area on the border between Samaria and Galilee. And then as he was entering a town, these are all clear statements that this is a story about marginal places and who lives in these marginal places. That's the whole setup for this story. People in places on the margins. And then it just adds, I think, a little bit more. So he was looking for something out of these 10 lepers. He was looking for someone who knew when disobeying Jesus is the right thing to do. Anyway, I'll leave it there. Here's a couple of questions to maybe get us thinking. What people today might be like these lepers? People that have been excluded from worship within their churches and that have been marginalized. Or how can we be Jesus to these people? How can we see them like Jesus did and then do something to assist them? And what does the church need to do to be more inclusive of these kind of people?